Ever imagine a military force as a tree drawing its lifeblood from the ground?
Okay.
That's the essence of a base of operations,
Yeah.
and it's something Clausewitz dives deep into in Chapter 15 of On War, which we'll be unpacking today.
All right.
Knowing your line of work, this isn't just theoretical, it's about understanding the bedrock of military might.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that Clausewitz doesn't treat the base as some static dot on the map.
Right.
He digs into how it's a dynamic system as alive and vulnerable as that tree, which can determine the fate of a whole campaign.
Okay, so let's break this down.
Yeah.
He uses this analogy of an army being like a tree drawing sustenance from the ground.
Right.
But what does that actually mean when we're talking 19th century warfare?
It's a brilliant visual, right?
Yeah.
The ground isn't just a location, it's the entire network of resources. An army relies on food, ammunition, reinforcements, the works. And just like a tree's roots,
Wow.
those supply lines need to be strong and healthy for the army to function.
So it's less about having a base, more about what that base represents, that connection back to your source of power,
Yes.
keeping the whole war machine running.
Exactly. And Clausewitz highlights that as armies grow larger,
Right.
this connection becomes even more vital.
Okay.
A small detachment might live off the land, but a massive force needs a robust and reliable base.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You can't exactly forage for cannonballs.
Right.
And speaking of resources, Clausewitz talks about using enemy territory as a resource.
Yes.
I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a tricky one.
Right.
He acknowledges that to some extent you can utilize conquered territory for supplies,
Sure.
but he's very clear about the dangers of over-reliance.
Because it's inherently unstable.
Yes.
You're always at risk.
Precisely. Relying on enemy territory for essential supplies is like building your house on a fault line.
Oh.
You're constantly vulnerable to counterattacks, sabotage your supplies drying up. It's a precarious situation.
It's interesting how that resonates even more today with the complexities of modern warfare.
Absolutely.
Guerrilla warfare, for instance,
Yeah.
must make this concept even more challenging.
Absolutely. Think about the challenges of counterinsurgency.
Right.
Even when you control a region on paper, securing those supply lines in hostile territory is a whole other battle.
Right.
Clausewitz was writing in the 19th century, but he was already recognizing the strategic depth a secure base provides
Yeah.
and how overreaching can backfire.
And he uses a great example to illustrate this, right?
He does.
Something about the Russian retreat in 1812.
That's a key takeaway from this chapter. He points out how the Russians, during their retreat, became overly reliant on a single, very long supply line.
Which, strategically speaking, is a big no-no.
Huge. This lack of flexibility severely limited their ability to maneuver and ultimately hindered their efforts to outmaneuver Napoleon.
It's like Clausewitz is saying, look, you can have the strongest army in the world, but if your base isn't secure, if your supply lines are vulnerable, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Exactly. It's not just about winning battles. It's about sustaining the war effort over time.
Right.
And that's where the base, with all its complexities, becomes absolutely critical.
So we're seeing that the base isn't just some static storehouse.
Right.
It's a dynamic force that directly shapes your strategic options.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between playing checkers and playing chess. You have to think several moves ahead.
And you have to understand that every move you make, every decision you make on the battlefield has implications for your base and your ability to sustain the fight.
Right.
And this is where that tree analogy becomes even more relevant.
Yeah.
Just like a tree needs healthy roots to thrive, a military force needs a strong and adaptable base to survive and succeed.
So it's not just about having a single fortified location.
Right.
It's about that entire network of resources and how well you can maintain it.
You've got it. Clausewitz actually uses the example of fortresses to illustrate this point. He argues that while they can be important for securing certain types of supplies, they shouldn't be mistaken for the base itself.
So it's like thinking a single leaf represents the whole tree.
Yeah.
You're missing the bigger picture.
Precisely. It's about the dynamic interplay of resources, geography, logistics.
Right.
He cautions against getting fixated on just the physical location, on seeing it as some static point on a map.
Right.
And this really gets interesting when we consider the evolution of warfare.
Oh, absolutely. If Clausewitz was concerned about the vulnerability of long supply lines back then,
Right.
imagine what he'd say about modern warfare. The distances, the technology, the sheer scale of it all.
It's mind-boggling. If we're sticking with the tree analogy, it's like that single tree is now a whole sprawling forest with roots spanning continents.
Yeah.
A modern military relies on this incredibly complex web of suppliers, transportation systems, communication networks. It's a whole different ballgame.
And a whole new level of vulnerability, I'd imagine.
Disruptions to global supply chains,
Right.
cyber attacks, targeting logistics,
Wow.
even something like a pandemic. All of these can have a huge impact on a military's ability to operate effectively.
Yeah.
It's like Clausewitz is whispering to us from the past, don't forget about the base.
He was ahead of his time.
Yeah.
It really underscores how crucial a strong and resilient base of operations is,
Right.
especially as warfare becomes more technologically dependent.
Yes.
But it's not just about having the biggest, most high-tech toys, is it?
Not at all. Clausewitz would argue that it's about being adaptable, being
Right.
able to anticipate threats to your base and adjust your strategy accordingly.
Okay.
He'd probably look at the complexities of modern warfare and say, see, I told you so.
He'd probably have a field day with it.
Yeah.
But on that note of adaptability,
Yeah.
didn't he also make a distinction between different types of Army needs? Something about what you can get locally versus what needs to come from your base.
You're right, he does. He talks about how certain needs, like basic provision, can often be met by what he calls a cultivated country, meaning the resources available in the theater of operations.
Right.
But then there are those needs that can only be met by your basemen arms munitions,
Right.
the things that keep an army fighting fit.
Right.
These need secure supply lines.
It's the difference between foraging for berries and needing a steady supply of ammunition. You
Yeah.
can't just whip up a cannon on the fly.
Exactly. And this distinction is even more critical today.
Yeah.
Modern militaries rely on such specialized equipment, complex logistics, sophisticated technology.
Right.
You can't just cobble those things together in the field. That connection back to your base, to your source of power.
Yeah.
It's the lifeline of a modern army.
And I'd imagine that as technology advances, as warfare becomes even more specialized,
Right.
that connection will only become more important.
Absolutely. Clausewitz was writing in the age of muskets and cannons.
Right.
But his insights about the base, about those essential lifelines of an army,
Yeah.
they resonate even more strongly in our modern era of drones and cyber warfare. It's like he's saying the tools of war may change, but the principles remain the same.
It's that timeless wisdom that makes Clausewitz so relevant even centuries later.
Yeah.
But it's not just about holding on to the past, is it?
Right.
It's about taking these core principles and applying them to the complexities of modern warfare.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because the base itself is no longer just a physical location. It's a network, a concept, almost a living, breathing organism.
I like that, living organism.
Yeah.
Because it needs to be able to adapt and evolve just as quickly as the battlefield itself.
Right.
But how do you even begin to wrap your head around something that complex?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And thankfully, Clausewitz gives us some clues.
Yeah.
He emphasizes this idea of strategic thinking,
Okay.
of anticipating your enemy's move,
Yeah.
of always being a step ahead.
So it's not just about reacting to threats to your base.
That's right.
It's about predicting them before they even happen.
Precisely. And that requires a deep understanding, not just of your own capabilities, but
Sure.
of your enemies, of the terrain of the political landscape.
Right.
It's about connecting the dots and seeing the bigger picture.
It's like playing 3D chess with the fate of nations hanging in the balance. No pressure.
Right. But seriously, the point is that Clausewitz gives us this framework for understanding the importance of the base,
Yeah.
even or perhaps especially in the face of overwhelming complexity.
So if we're going to bring this back to our listener,
Yeah.
who's out there on the front lines,
Right.
what's the key message we want them to take away from Clausewitz?
Yeah.
What's the one thing that will make them a better soldier,
Well,
a leader?
I think the most important takeaway is that the base isn't just some abstract concept. It's the foundation upon which all military operations are built.
Right.
And just like a house built on sand is doomed to crumble, a military campaign that neglects its base is destined for failure.
It's the difference between fighting a battle and building a campaign that can actually achieve its objectives.
Exactly. And that requires understanding that the base is dynamic.
Right.
It's complex, and it demands constant attention and adaptation.
It's not just about winning today's battle.
Right.
It's about ensuring you can keep fighting and winning tomorrow and the next day and the next.
Precisely. And that's where the real strategic thinking comes in.
It's about seeing the base not just as a source of supplies,
Right.
but as a force multiplier, a strategic asset that can make or break your entire campaign.
Well said. And I think Clausewitz would wholeheartedly agree.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Clausewitz on the base of operations,
Mm.
is there anything else you think our listeners should keep in mind?
You know, as I was rereading this chapter,
Yeah.
one line really jumped out at me.
Oh.
Clausewitz says, "The base is not a question of geography, but of strategy."
Oh.
And I think that perfectly encapsulates the essence of his argument.
It's not about where your base is, but about how you use it,
Yes.
how it fits into your overall strategy.
Yeah, exactly. It's about understanding that the base isn't static. It's not just a fixed point on a map. It's a dynamic system that needs to adapt and evolve alongside your campaign.
It's like that old saying, no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Right.
Your base needs to be flexible enough to change as the situation on the ground changes.
Precisely. And that's where a deep understanding of Clausewitzian principles can make all the difference.
So to wrap things up, what are some key takeaways our listener can apply to their own military thinking?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the base is not some abstract concept. It's the foundation upon which all military operations are built.
Okay.
It's dynamic, it's complex,
All right.
and it demands constant attention and adaptation.
It's the difference between just fighting a battle and having a real shot at winning the war.
Well said. And I think Clausewitz would wholeheartedly agree.
And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Clausewitz's take on bases of operations.
A pleasure.
Until next time.